Good morning. My name is George Cochrane. I'm coming to you from my studio in New York to take a few minutes of your time to talk about the decision-making process that went into my selection of the three different source texts that I used to make my new manuscript for Dante's Divine Comedy. The first important fact, of course, is that there is no known edition of Dante's poem in his hand. There is no autograph copy that we have found, though we remain hopeful. And so what we have is we have a poem that has been transmitted initially through manuscripts, ultimately into print form, and finally probably digitally, through which we encounter the poem. In fact, we only seem to have securely datable manuscripts from as early as about 15 years after Dante's death. And this creates problems. There is also the problem of the numerous copies of the poem that survive over a relatively long period, but nonetheless there are, I think, over 600 extant manuscripts. So there's a lot of material, none of which is Dante's hand. And so we have all been left to try to figure out what version of Dante's poem would be the most accurate, the most correct, and it's ultimately an unsolvable conundrum. However, I began my edition through the familiar route of Giorgio Petrocchi's edition, which he produced in 1966-1967 for Inferno. I chose it because, despite having been criticized quite heavily in the years since its publication, it remains the standard Italian edition. That if you read the poem today, you're likely to encounter that text, despite having attempts by more recent authors, so to speak, such as Sanguinetti. There are updates to Petrocchi's edition, and when I looked into them, I wasn't really satisfied with the kind of transparency I was hoping for, I guess, in how they were made to be different from Petrocchi's. With the rationale, I'm sure it exists somewhere, but it wasn't readily available to me as I read them. So I was left with the situation of what text to choose next. After bringing the reader in through the familiar Petrocchi in the opening canticle. And here the project takes a decidedly artistic turn. That, as this is an original creation coming from my whim and imagination, I decided that I could look to the earliest copies of the poem and copy them. And I could copy them without modernizing the text at all, because there do exist modernized transcriptions of important facsimiles. The Poggiali, the Filippino, the Trivulziano, even the Estense, all have, and I'm sure more, have transcriptions available that we can read. But they have modern punctuation, modern spelling, and I was interested in this idea of taking the opportunity to sort of give something back, in a way, to the Italian reader, to the Italian culture. Because my life has been made so rich through my experiences of living in Italy and learning the language, working with Dante, that I felt somehow obliged through my work to offer the Italian reader something that he or she simply won't have encountered before. And that's hard to do with Dante, because it's all been done, right? How do you add to the history of scholarship and art? There's already been Botticelli. What do you do, right? So I was determined to kind of push that all aside, all critical apparatus aside, and instead focus on giving the reader a direct experience of their own language as it would have been written by Dante himself. That by presenting the language as it appears in manuscripts, going back as early as we can the reader struggles. The reader struggles because words are pushed together that today are separated. Spelling is regularized today. You might have come with an H. You might have it without. There are numerous alternate spellings. No punctuation. So the reader has to work to understand who's talking and when and what they're saying. And this allows the reader the space that everyone who has created a modern version has had to look at what was written and puzzle it out for themselves. To have that primary experience with the language at its foundation, because we know how important Dante's work was to the creation and the kind of codification of the Tuscan language, dialect, as the fundamental Italian language. So the reader has a chance to read a manuscript that was made very close to the death of Dante. My updating it is only that I don't render it in ancient medieval script, which I consider to be sort of a kitsch operation because we don't write like that. And I wrote it in comic font for two reasons. One, to make the connection again between illuminated manuscripts and comic books. They both tell stories using words and pictures in a sequential order, but also for kind of maximum legibility. That comic font is very clean, it's very easy to read, and I present Dante's poem that way. The selection that I made of the Codice Landiano from 1336 and the Trivulziano 1080 from 1337 are to a degree capricious choices, although I wouldn't perhaps go so far, and to say that I wanted to find the earliest manuscripts that are reproduced in facsimile. I'm not talking about on a computer screen available for download, because that's not the scribal experience I wanted. I wanted to copy from a book. And the earliest manuscript that I learned of, there may be one that's earlier or unavailable or unattainable in my in what I can do, was this Landiano, which in 1921, to celebrate the 600 years since Dante's death, was published in facsimile in 175 copies. Through Facsimile Finder and Giovanni Scorcioni's help, I secured a copy, and I copied exactly from the Landiano for my text, making extremely few exceptions, usually for, or exclusively for, when a symbol was used to represent a word, I wrote the word. So if a P appears with a cross through the descender, which indicates per, I wrote per. If the Latin shorthand for et is there, I write et. But otherwise, it's a straight copy. And to me, this represents a really interesting moment, potentially, for the reader. Which is to say that there are famous early manuscripts that have been transcribed. So you can read them. But not the Landiano. It's virtually unstudied. There was an intensive study by a gentleman whose name I'm forgetting at the moment, when the facsimile was published, and that analysis had to do with going through the manuscript and making notations where corrections were made after the fact, and perhaps in a different hand. Petrocchi himself has a short essay from his examination of the Landiano, but it's never been transcribed. So unless you have the original, which is in Piacenza in the library, or you have one of the 175 copies or access to it, you can't read this early manuscript. Now you can, because I've transcribed it. For Paradiso, I chose the Trivulziano. Why? Because it's one of the most famed, if not the most famed, considered to be important, definitive early manuscripts. It's written in an incredible hand, very few mistakes. 1337 datable. And Giorgio Lanza, in 1995, transcribed it into modern Italian. However, he also changed it. And I'm not just talking about modernizing and unifying, regularizing spelling or adding punctuation, which he did. I'm talking about actually changing words and phrases. I don't know why. He doesn't explain it. Mine doesn't. Mine is from the original, copied, again through a facsimile, created by the same publisher, hopefully, in 1921. So we have Inferno by Petrocchi, Purgatorio is the Landiano, and Paradiso is the Cebruziano 1080. I hope that explains a little bit my choices, and my final thoughts are just that those choices again reflect my kind of artistic instincts when it comes to approaching this ultimately uncertain text. And so I take that uncertainty and I kind of bring it back to the viewer and put it in their lap in the form of my book, and they can have their own experience directly, unmitigated by modernization, with all of its attendant struggles. But they can have access to something as close as any of us have to Dante's original presentation. Thank you.